before there was an empire, before there were legions and senators and gods carved from marble. Before the name Rome meant anything to anyone, there was a hill. Just a hill, unremarkable, windswept, overlooking a river that flooded every spring and bred malaria in the summer heat. No one standing on that hill in the year 1000 BC would have looked around and thought, "This is where it begins." But it was. This is the story of Rome, not the Rome you know, but the Rome that came before, the world that made the empire possible, the mud and the shepherds and the wolves and the myth, because nothing this powerful begins in glory. It begins in survival. When Italy emerged into the light of recorded history around 700 BC, it was already inhabited by various peoples of different cultures and languages. Most lived in villages or small towns, supported by agriculture and animal husbandry. The very name Italia is believed to mean calf land. The peninsula was a patchwork of peoples. In the north, the Etruscans, sophisticated, literate, powerful. They built cities with roads and temples and a writing system the Romans would eventually borrow. In the south, Greek colonists who had sailed west and planted their civilization like a flag in foreign soil. They called it Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. And for time, it was. And in the middle, in a flat, fever-ridden plain called Latium, lived a quieter people. Farmers, shepherds, people who built no great monuments and wrote down no great histories. They called themselves the Latins, and from them would come everything. Latin huts on a hillside, fire burning at center. The Latins established themselves in the part of central Italy known in ancient times as Latium. They were shepherds and farmers, and they lived in huts. Each of their villages formed a small community governed by a king, and by 800 BC, there were about 40 such villages united in a loose religious federation. Think about what that means. 40 villages, each one with its own petty king, each one clinging to its hillside, watching the plains for raiders, counting its livestock, burying its dead. At the head of this federation was the city of Alba Longa on the Alban Hills. Every year the Latins traveled there to celebrate a great religious festival lasting 4 days. Ceremonies were performed in the temple of the chief Latin god, Jupiter Latiaris. Jupiter, the sky god, the thunder god. The Latins were building a religion before they had an alphabet. They were building a community before they had walls. And they were building something else, something harder to name, a shared identity, a sense they belonged to something larger than their own village fire. That instinct, that reaching toward collective power, would one day swallow the known world. The area the ancient Latins called Latium consisted of a plain beside the river Tiber and along the coast, mostly malaria-ridden swamp, and hills of rich vegetation and easily cultivated soil. At first, the Latins settled in the hills, but they did not neglect the plain. The Tiber River was the artery of this world. It flooded. It stank. In summer it turned sluggish and warm and brought disease with it. The Romans would struggle with malaria for centuries. It shaped their architecture, their settlement patterns, their very philosophy of endurance. But the Tiber was also wealth. It was the only major commercial route in central Italy. Fish, trade, movement. Rome lay 12 miles inland from the sea on the Tiber River, the border between Latium and Etruria. Because the site commanded a convenient river crossing and lay on a land route from the Apennines to the sea, it formed the meeting point of 3 distinct peoples: Latins, Etruscans, and Sabines. A meeting point. That is the most important thing to understand about Rome before Rome existed. It was not chosen for beauty. It was not chosen for safety. It was chosen because it sat at the intersection of everything: trade, migration, conflict. The hills above the Tiber were not just a home. They were a strategic position. And the Latins, practical, patient, stubborn, understood that. Archaeological finds have confirmed that there were 2 fortified settlements in the 8th century BC in the area of the future Rome, one on the Palatine Hill, the other on the Quirinal Hill. These were simply three of numerous Italic-speaking communities that existed in Latium by the first millennium BC. Bos, Walla, Blog, two villages, separated by a valley. They would have known each other, traded perhaps, raided each other's livestock in lean years, competed for the same grazing land, the same fishing spots, the same marriage alliances. It was in the 8th century BC that these two existing settlements combined to form a single village, corresponding to roughly the same dates as the founding legend. Facebook, two villages becoming one. It sounds small. It sounds unremarkable. But this is how Rome begins. Not with a miracle, not with a god descending from the heavens, but with two groups of people deciding that together they were stronger than apart. That decision, that merger, echoes through every subsequent century of Roman history. Rome was always, at its core, an act of expansion, of absorption, of taking the outsider and making them Roman. It started here, on two hills above a river, before anyone had given it a name. By tradition, it was on the 21st of April, 753 BC, that the Latins added a new village on the Palatine Hill to the many scattered villages of Latium. It was given the name of Rome, perhaps because in bygone days the Tiber had been called Rumone. The founding rites were not simple. A group of peasants arrived on the hill where the new city was to arise. A fire of brushwood was lit, and each man jumped through the flame to cleanse himself from all evil. The man chosen to be the city's founder drove a deep furrow with a plow, and each man present threw into it a little earth from his own village. Think about what that ritual means. Every man brought earth from where he came from his home village, from the ground where his father was buried, and he threw it into the furrow, into the new city. He was saying, I give this place everything I was, and in return, I become something new. That is Rome. That has always been Rome. A place made of people who gave up what they were to become something larger. But history alone was never enough for Rome. Rome needed a myth, a story worthy of what it would become. And so, sometime in the 4th century BC, when Rome was already powerful enough to need a divine origin story, the legend of Romulus and Remus was born. According to the traditional Roman narrative, King Numitor of the mythical city of Alba Longa was betrayed and deposed by his younger brother Amulius. Fearing his brother's daughter might produce an heir to challenge his rule, Amulius forced her to become a Vestal virgin. Despite enforced chastity, she became pregnant, some said by Mars, the god of war himself. Google support. Twin sons were born, Romulus and Remus. Amulius ordered that the twins be drowned in the Tiber River. They survived and were washed ashore at the foot of the Palatine Hill, where they were suckled and reared by a she-wolf until they were found by a shepherd called Faustulus. A she-wolf, nursing two abandoned children of a god. It is a strange image. A wild, dangerous animal, the enemy of the shepherd, choosing to nurture rather than devour. Rome, from its very first story, was built on the idea that power could be domesticated, that the savage thing and the civilized thing were not opposites. They were the same thing, at different moments. After being raised by Faustulus and his wife, and learning their true origins, the brothers gathered a band of warriors, attacked Alba Longa, killed Amulius, and restored their grandfather to the throne. Having done so, they set out to found a new settlement at the site where they had been saved by the she-wolf. Google support. But there was a problem. There is always a problem. The twins came into conflict during the foundation of the city. The dispute is variously said to have been over the naming of the new city, the interpretation of auguries, whether to place it on the Palatine or Aventine Hill, or concerned with Remus's disrespect of the new town's ritual wall. Remus mocked his brother. He leapt over Romulus's half-built wall to prove it was too low to defend anything, that a wall you could jump over protected no one. He was right. Eventually the conflict came to blows, and Romulus slew his brother Remus, giving the city its new name, Rome. The first act of Rome was a murder. A brother killed by a brother. Over a wall. Rome began, in its own myth, with blood between kinsmen. And if you know anything about what came after, you'll recognize that this was not a warning buried in the story. It was a prophecy. Now pause. Because we need to separate two things that history has tangled together for 2,000 years. The myth, beautiful, brutal, perfect for a people who would one day rule the world. And the reality, quieter, stranger, and in many ways more remarkable. The modern understanding of Rome's foundation is characterized by both archaeological analysis and ancient myth. Much of what is known about Rome's early days is based on later writings composed many years after the events they describe. The legend of Romulus and Remus was written down centuries after it supposedly happened, by men who had every political reason to make Rome's origins sound divine. But archaeology tells a different story. Excavations made in 2014 revealed a wall built long before the city's official founding year. Archaeologists discovered 9th century BC walls and 8th century BC pottery. The Palatine Hill may have been visited and settled as early as the 10th century BC. Boss Walla blog. The wall existed before Romulus. The settlement existed before myth. Rome was not born in a single act of violence on a spring morning in 753 BC. Rome grew, slowly, organically, village by village, hill by hill, generation by generation, until one day it was large enough to need a founding story, and powerful enough to make the world believe it. But the Latins did not build Rome alone. After 650 BC, the Etruscans became dominant in Italy and expanded into north-central Italy. Senior officials of the Roman Republic derived their insignia from the Etruscans: the curule chair, the purple-bordered toga, and the bundle of rods known as fasces. Hub. The Etruscans were Rome's first great teachers. They were, in many ways, everything the early Romans were not: literate, urban, sophisticated. They built proper cities with sewage systems and temples, and a tradition of augury, reading the future in the entrails of birds and the flight patterns of lightning. Roman tradition claimed that Rome had been under the control of 7 kings from 753 to 509 BC. The last 3 kings were said to be Etruscan: Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. Boss Walla blog. For over a century, Rome was ruled by Etruscan kings. Think about what that means. The city that would later define itself through its hatred of kings was built, in part, by them. The Romans were not embarrassed by this. They absorbed the Etruscans the same way they would later absorb the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Gauls. They took what was useful and made it Roman. That talent, for absorption, for adaptation, for stealing the best ideas of everyone they conquered, was Rome's greatest weapon, long before they had legions. The Latins lived in rough clay huts with straw roofs. In the beginning, Rome too was a little village of such huts. Its inhabitants were shepherds and peasants. This is the world that made Rome. Not marble, not gold, not gods walking among men. Mud, straw, the smell of livestock, the sound of a river flooding in spring, and the crack of summer heat on dry earth. A people who learned to survive together, because survival alone was not enough. Who built a federation of 40 villages around a shared religion, and a shared language, and a shared stubborn refusal to be absorbed by the Etruscans to the north, or the Greeks to the south. Who looked at a malarial hill above a river that flooded every year, and saw, not a problem, but a position. This is the world that made Rome possible. The world that forged, in poverty and proximity and violence, the qualities that would one day carry Roman eagles to the edges of the known earth. Endurance, pragmatism, the ability to turn an outsider into a Roman. And one thing more: ambition. Bottomless, patient, generational ambition. By the time Rome had its first king, Romulus, or whoever the man behind the myth truly was, it was already something the world had not quite seen before. Not a city-state like Athens, defined by the brilliance of a single culture. Not a kingdom like Egypt, defined by the permanence of a river and a pharaoh. Rome was a process, a machine for growth, a community that had learned, before it learned anything else, how to take what it needed from the world around it and make it its own. The mud was still there. The straw roofs were still burning in the fires of the Palatine. The she-wolf was still carved into stone above the city gates. But Rome was no longer just a village. It was a question the world hadn't thought to ask yet. What happens when a people who have nothing decide they want everything? Next week on Vault of Echoes, Rome had shepherds. Rome had mud. Rome had 40 villages and a borrowed alphabet and a myth about a wolf. But Rome did not yet have kings. And kings, as Rome was about to discover, were both the making of a city and the beginning of its undoing. The first blood had already been spilled between brothers. The second would be spilled between a king and the people who put him on his throne. Episode 2. Blood and Foundation. How Rome was built on murder and myth. Subscribe. And remember what the world forgot.